here. So, accountability in public ministry is the theme for tonight. And I'll say here in a minute that I have some mixed associations with that word accountability. And so I was thinking about what's the heart of it. And as I was reflecting on that, I just thought of the word itself and breaking that word into two parts: accountability. And that maybe the heart of accountability is, at least as I'm talking about it, is how do we account, is developing that ability to account for our gifts. That there's an assumption that each of us has spiritual gifts, as we've talked about, and every meeting has gifts. And so, how do we, there's a stewardship sense of this, that how do we account for those gifts by naming, nurturing, and affirming them? And I heard that in some of our discussion, right? The value of somebody saying, have you, I see this gift in you. Would you like to explore being recorded? That's, I'm really excited to hear that, because that's sometimes, as another friend mentioned, that's not always the case. Sometimes we are awkward in talking about those gifts. And so that's kind of a basic for that word. So I'm going to here talk about one of the primary ways we exercise that accountability is through the recording process. And Wendy will share from the Liberal Friends tradition, and I'll share from how this is expressed among programmed friends. At least two examples here. One is from Evangelical Friends, and one is from Friends United Meeting. And so, just for kind of getting a sense of how that process works, I'll give these two examples. And of course, this is kind of the ideal of how it works, but in practice, it doesn't always work that way. So for Evangelical Friends, I'm using an example of Mid-America. Has meetings in Kansas and Texas primarily, I believe. Michael J can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but what they describe as a process is recognizing that gift. So the elders recognizing that gift of someone in the meeting, and then reporting that to the congregation, and then making a recommendation to the general superintendent. So there, for some Evangelical Friends, they have a little bit of a different system. They have area superintendents and a general superintendent. And so the general superintendent then will actually kick it over to the area superintendent, who will meet with that candidate and select a mentor for this kind of 2-year apprenticeship process. So they're studying things, they're practicing things, they're talking about what they experience and what they learn. And then when that's done, they're interviewed by the area elder board and recommended to the yearly meeting elders. And then if all goes well there's a review, and then they're recommended to the yearly meeting representatives, who in the annual sessions will approve and then record and recognize and celebrate those candidates who are then recorded. So that's one example from Evangelical Friends Church. And then for the kind of FUM examples, Wilmington Yearly Meeting has meetings in Ohio and Tennessee. And there again is the ministry and council will recognize the gift of a friend in the meeting, and then they'll have a clearness committee, and then bring that name to the business meeting to see if that's something folks feel clear about proceeding with, and they'll recommend this minister to the yearly meeting. And at that point, the candidate will come under the care of the training and recording committee that's part of Wilmington Yearly Meeting. And then there's just kind of a process of discerning, educating, and mentoring, a little bit similar to what we talked about with Mid-America. Maybe not quite as long, depending on the person and their background. And then they're recommended to the yearly meeting, ministry and council. And again, if that's cleared, then it's approved by the whole yearly meeting at their sessions. And then there's also that recording and recognition process, with the whole yearly meeting. So one thing that has changed about their process is they used to also have, the candidates go from the local meeting, the monthly meeting, and then they would go to the quarterly meeting and then to the yearly meeting. But they've cut out the quarterly meeting part because it maybe just wasn't very particularly functional or necessary. So that's really the basics of the process. Again, it doesn't always work that way, and there's um, lots of factors involved in this process. I actually am an example of how it didn't work that well because I was when I was first kind of starting in public ministry, uh, the yearly meeting I was a part of was just in the crack stage of a split, and so that process of recording had kind of become a gatekeeping thing of what do you believe about this or that issue. And so I was actually advised by my mentor, the lead pastor of the meeting, to not go through that process, but that they would support me in my ministry outside of that. And now I'm pastoring at a meeting that's independent. So there's nowhere to go up that ladder, so to speak. So yeah. Oh, and I was gonna say that growing up among evangelical friends, the main two paths to recording were for pastors and maybe missionaries. And if you were called to ministry or full-time ministry, those were the paths. But I think there's some expanding of that, especially among FUM meetings, that there's, educators or activists or others who are also recorded. And so, Wendy, I'll turn it over to you to share from your tradition.
So, what often comes up when I say I am a public minister is we don't have those. Um, so my yearly meeting is dually affiliated with Friends United meeting and Friends General Conference. It's Baltimore yearly meeting, and we skew FGC. We are very dominantly liberal, unprogrammed friends.
It's me.
Um, and when I hear, but we don't have ministers, um, obviously, I think we are all ministers. So we do have ministers. The joke is, we did away with the laity, not the clergy. We are all clergy. Um, and So, if we are all ministers, why would some people be a public minister? Why would someone be a full-time minister? And there is very clear resistance to what we call hireling ministers. There's a connection that we've made between ministry and pastors. Um, I was actually several years ago at Pendle Hill, and I said that my ministry interest at the time was pastoral care, which is, the word that our meetings use for, how we are called to take care of each other. We very often have a pastoral care committee in a liberal meeting, for instance. And this friend looked very offended, and she said, "But we don't have pastors." So, I feel like I, really can't comment on pastoral traditions. But I feel very qualified to talk about liberal traditions. Um, and I would say that we have a lot of misunderstanding about our own traditions, and what the history of these, these conflicts that we're having with each other are. And I would say there is a very live conflict right now. Because of the people in this room and hundreds of other people who feel very called into full-time ministry and are interested in support and accountability structures inside the liberal tradition and are just not finding them. Can you give me the next slide, please, Andy? Thank you. So, I engaged primarily with Rashid Darden, who works at Friends General Conference, but engaged with Friends General Conference on the question of public ministry, um, and they very kindly paid me to write a series of essays on the topic. So actually, FGC is another great permission giver. I feel like you know. My relationship with FGC has really changed over the years, and I feel like a lot of positive work is happening at FGC right now, and some really important issues, and this is one of them. Um, so Rashid, as part of that effort, created a survey on public ministry for liberal friends. And much to both of our surprises, 199 people responded to that survey. And it really did not seem that very many of those respondents were absolutely hostile to the idea of public ministry. In fact, 71.6% of respondents knew what it was, or felt that they knew what it was, and believed that a formal recording process would be necessary to consider someone a public minister. Um, so what I am taking from that is people receiving this survey, while not maybe not representative of all liberal friends, um, by and large, are not hostile to the idea at all. And that's interesting to me because, when you send out, just sort of anecdotally, when I ask for evaluations for a course I've run or something, people are much more likely to respond to that request if they're angry. And we weren't getting those kinds of responses by and large to this survey. There was an urging towards recording processes amongst liberal friends. So you might be surprised to know, and I think most people who took this survey would be surprised to know that in fact we have those processes in our faith and practice documents. As part of that work for FGC, I looked at the faith and practice documents for all of the FGC affiliated yearly meetings. Um, and not all the faith and practice documents had something analogous to recording. Sometimes they call it embracing, sometimes they call it releasing. They didn't all have something in there explicitly speaking on that, but most of them did. And every single yearly meeting had some kind of accommodation, maybe not in the faith and practice, but in documents from business meetings at annual session, small funds that are run by the yearly meetings that are really meant to support public ministry. So it's kind of a weird helter-skelter world. But the truth is that there is the beginning of a process or a process that is written down somewhere inside your yearly meeting if you are a liberal friend. And I know this to be a fact. But, most of us are not aware of that, probably because we've been hushed as soon as we started to talk about this issue inside the context of our local worshiping community. And I want to say one more thing before we move on to the next slide. I thought it was really interesting that almost everyone said they can identify public ministers in their community, even as they acknowledged that a recording process is necessary but absent. That there is a kind of intuition about, who the teachers, the leaders, the speakers, the facilitators, who these people are in their lives, and an appreciation for them. So we're going to get into this more later, but if this is true, and I think it is true, I think what I'm saying is true, that the evidence bears this out, that liberal friends have a sense of who is a full-time public minister. Um, and yet there are no accountability structures that are actually being utilized. What does this mean about who is receiving support, if anyone? So, um, this is, the question I asked is kind of leading into this. Why is accountability important? Um, some of us, including myself, have an allergic reaction to the idea that someone might hold us accountable, particularly a meeting that has been hostile to us. How can we trust them to hold us accountable? Is this just giving them permission to hurt us more? A lot of Quakers in the liberal traditions, and I'm going to let Andy speak to pastoral traditions, um, are full-time public ministers who are somewhat or completely estranged from their monthly meetings at this point. What does this mean? Like, it's nonsensical, but I understand it emotionally. I've been there. So when we think about accountability, is it just that we are accountable to a group of people that we are in conflict with? No, they're also accountable to the ministry. That is what accountability means in the Quaker context. When we are all carrying the light of God inside of us, and God is in conversation with God's self through our relationships and our ministry, accountability goes both ways. And I'll let Andy change the slide.
Excuse me. Yeah, well, like Windy, I have some less than positive associations with the word accountability. Not only because, I have that very human tendency to not want to be accountable to others, but also kind of growing up in evangelical circles, we talked about accountability a lot. In fact, often we would have what were called accountability partners or accountability groups. And what that typically meant was um, somebody or somebody's that you would meet with regularly and say, hey, did you read your Bible every morning before school and pray, for half an hour? And or for teenage boys, just stereotyping here, but that's just how it was. It's like, did you lust or look at pornography? And so these were the examples of accountability that kind of were um, intended to be helpful, and sometimes were, but also sometimes kind of became this like check the box with a generous heaping of guilt and shame mixed in. And so sometimes I hear accountability and I think of that. Um, and so that's kind of one extreme that's like the invasive, controlling example of accountability. But then, just doing away with accountability leaves us with something that's not any more desirable. So, the other extreme would be sometimes you get like charismatic, you know, preachers in a mega church or whatever. Doesn't have to be a mega church, but just um, that have very little accountability. And then we end up hearing about them on the news of how they had a, had a breakdown or had a moral failure or whatever. And having neither the support they need nor the challenge that would be healthy. And so, um, kind of avoiding those two extremes.
If I have been thinking, I would tell you to wash your sheets too.
What would be a healthy example of accountability? Um, so here's a couple of things too from sometimes I find it helpful to kind of step outside of my own tradition and here are some critiques from people on the outside looking in. And this, I apologize, it's very um, male dominant language. It reflects the time. But Thomas Merton talked about the most dangerous man in the world is the contemplative, who is guided by nobody. And I think we could insert public minister in there as well. He trusts his own visions. He obeys the attractions of an interior voice, but will not listen to others. He identifies the will of God with anything that makes him feel, within his own heart, a big, warm, sweet interior glow. The sweeter and the warmer the feeling is, the more he is convinced of his own infallibility. And so that's that extreme of the individual who believes every feeling, every thought, everything that comes that they're an infallible prophet. And then G.K. Chesterton is a similar, I don't know the context here, but it seems like he's taking aim at Quakers because he specifically talks about the inner light. I won't read the whole quote, but basically just the danger of relying only on our inner light. Whereas the value of being a Christian or a Quaker or part of a larger group is that we have the light of all of us and we have the light of other sources. So, the importance of having accountability for those reasons, but also Quakerism really works best when we have this creative tension between the individual or the minister and the community or the meeting and the yearly meeting. And so there's kind of this tension back and forth that I think makes ministry fruitful. And so accountability is about that mutual relationship of voluntary, uh, mutual submission and support. That commitment creates a container to hold that creative tension. And I was thinking about Henry Nouwen, his definition of maturity, which is the willingness to be led where we would rather not go. And he's referring to a story in the Gospels where after Jesus' resurrection, he goes to Peter, who betrayed Jesus during the trauma of the crucifixion event, and he goes to restore Peter, and the famous story, where he says, "Do you love me? Then feed my sheep," restoring him to public ministry. But then he also says to Peter that he will be taken by a belt and led where he would rather not go, like a child. And Nouwen is saying that maturity is not only being willing to lead, which of course is very important as well, but the willingness to be led. And accountability creates that, again, that healthy tension between leading and also being led. And I would add willingness to be led where we would rather not go, so that together we can get where we want to get and become who we want to become. But it's not only about the end product, about the goal. The process of accountability is part of the purpose itself, of creating community, of creating a space where transformation can take place. But it's also important to remember this principle from Jesus that the Sabbath is made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. And so the processes we have, sometimes within Quakerism, we value the processes, which is important, but we can also sometimes get so caught up we realize the process should serve the people and ultimately point us to the presence. And so bringing these together, essentially, accountability creates the conditions for sustainability. Something that does, I totally understand it, but sometimes it frustrates me among pastors, is they will do their thing in the congregation, and then when there's an unhealthy um, conflict, or the elders or whatever do something that upsets them, they'll say, "Oh, I'm being led somewhere else." And then the next pastor comes in and the same exact process happens over and over again. And so it won't break, it won't heal until someone says, "I'm going to stay present. I'm going to be a differentiated person. I'm going to be accountable to my calling, but I'm also going to stay and engage this process." And so there are futures for your ministry and your meeting that are only possible with healthy accountability. And back to Windy.
So this is a picture that Lauren Brownlee posted on her Facebook page and let me use for this presentation. So thank you, Lauren. It's a picture of her at Pendle Hill with the Aurora Borealis that happened on my daughter's birthday, actually, on October 10th. And she was saying this was her first experience of it. She looks very gleeful in this picture. So I chose this picture actually of the gleeful Lauren, another public minister, because I know her to be a person that is always transforming and transforming others. Um, and I think, the reason why it is important to stick it out and have healthy conflict where healthy conflict is possible, and, insist on mutual accountability for ministry, even within, and maybe especially within, the liberal friends context, is because what we are called to do in each other's lives primarily is transform one another towards the divine inside of us. And our ministries, my ministry, if you don't know, for years, for a decade, was about interpersonal violence. And I'm moving away from that now. I don't feel as called to that anymore. Other people are feeling called to that. That's wonderful. Um, but that ministry was important. I am really proud, actually. Don't cut my head off, poppy cutters, but I'm really proud of the work that we did over the 10 years that I, was working diligently at great personal cost and suffering, as Ferline was saying, as, we labored around interpersonal violence, and a lot more labor needs to happen on that issue. But I think that it was kind of a ministry within a ministry. Like, the ministry is about transformation. The ministry is not about a product. A ministry is not about changing the world once and for all. Isaiah didn't change the world once and for all. He was a part of the world's labor, the constant laboring towards the divine. And our meetings are the places where that happens. Next slide, please.
I appreciate Wendy often talking about using that word laboring. And I think that's so appropriate because it's work. Ministry is work, relationships are work, love is work. But I've also appreciated thinking about laboring in another way in terms of the process of labor to give birth. And I really appreciate the insights from um, Valerie Koar, who is actually a Sikh believer, and she wrote a great book called "See No Strangers." But she talks about the work of ministry and social change using this metaphor of labor. And she says in the quote there, revolutionary love is the choice to labor for ourselves, for opponents, and for ourselves, and others, to transform the world around us and within us. I think that's what I hear Wendy saying as well, that it's not just it's about not just about a product or a goal, but about that transformational process and those relationships. If you've heard of her, you may be familiar with a quote that kind of made her famous in a speech with the Poor People's Campaign and some of the work they were doing, where she said, "In our tears and agony, we hold our children close and confront the truth. The future is dark, but my faith dares me to ask, what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country still waiting to be born?" I think that's really beautiful and really powerful. And I think we could say the same about our ministries. Um, that often it's journeying through that. It's the darkness of the womb, and what is being born in our lives, what's being born in our meetings or our yearly meetings. Um, and what she draws from that too is, who is your midwife? Who is guiding you through that birthing process? Um, and that's part of what that accountability relationship can be at its best, is that working together to birth something new in our ministry, in our meeting. And part of what a midwife does is helps us discern when to breathe and when to push in that process of giving birth. And that's really, really helpful, I think, when it comes to discerning our ministry and engaging that accountability, is knowing when to breathe and when to push. At least when I think about my ministry context at our meeting, that's something we're constantly discerning. Is this a time to breathe, let things happen, go with this, just stay centered ourselves, or is this the moment to push?
So, as mentioned earlier, I've spent years being a trauma educator amongst friends. Um, and so, what I think I have to offer about what we are laboring towards is very much informed by that first ministry that I carried and labored with for so long. on trauma. So you may be familiar to a greater or lesser extent with attachment theory. It is something that, people talk about in popular culture. Um, so specifically, there are, at least three forms of attachment. What is often called anxious attachment. This is a person whose tendency is to form relationships where they are always afraid of abandonment because of earlier experiences in life or current experiences. Um, and their trauma response is to reach out excessively and to, feel very insecure when they are not receiving affirmation from the person that they are in relationship with. An example of this would be, the person who writes you 50 text messages in a row because you didn't call them back. So you're dead or you have abandoned them. Um, and another common attachment style that we talk about is the avoidant attachment style. This person is also afraid of being abandoned because of early experiences in life or, ongoing experiences, but their trauma response is the opposite. What they tend to do is avoid intimacy. When they start getting too close to someone, they pull away. This is the person that ghosts you, the person that suddenly withdraws from any contact with you for no discernible reason. Unfortunately, anxious and avoidant people tend to partner with each other um, and trigger each other mightily. But the good news is that we can relearn attachment style by intentionally using our wisdom to create environments in which these fears of abandonment will be less and less often triggered. It requires to great degree the cooperation of people that you are in relationship with to create those environments. So let's look at someone that has a healthy attachment style, which honestly, I don't think this person really exists. I think we are all to lesser and greater extent caught in, our fear of abandonment. But, if we could attain secure attachment, this is what our experiences would be like. Your early experiences, if you're just like this and you haven't worked diligently to create this in yourself, were probably very stable, receptive. You were touched appropriately and often. Um, and you know that you're safe. Someone with a secure attachment style is not easily shaken by misfortune in life. Um, that, they just tend to kind of bounce back and be flexible and resilient. And theologically, they believe that God is good, the world is open, and they can be at peace. When they are challenged, when they face adversity, they just remember that God is good and that they are valued and loved. They assume that people mean well. And they tend to look for helpers, like Mr. Rogers told us to do. And they also can negotiate boundaries. These are people that can choose how open they are, how open they want to be. A securely attached person is not just okay with anything, but they can tell you when they're not, which an anxious or avoidant person might have trouble with. Um, they are able to be a non anxious presence to others and be a sort of midwife in other people's spiritual journeys because they are able to help ground others and facilitate growth towards security and others. And this is important when we're talking about transforming our meetings. When we think about the responses we get at meeting, what if instead of going into our shame place or our fight or flight place, what if we could be in a place where we could be the non-anxious presence to a meeting with a lot of anxiety? We can't just choose that. I tend to be an anxious attacher. Andy and I have had a lot of conversations about attachment. My husband tends to be an avoidant attacher, and we've done a lot of work with each other. We made a choice together. We are mutually accountable to creating an environment for each other where we can grow in maturity and wisdom and feel secure. And each time we make the other feel secure, the other is in a place to make the partner feel secure. And the same thing is true in your relationships, in your worshiping community. Next slide, please.
That sounds really wonderful. Just like I want to be that kind of public ministry, and I want someone like that to be a midwife in my own ministry. And I think I've had people that, nobody that I lives that out perfectly, but people that approximate that. That's really a lovely experience. And I thought it was important to say that I agree with Wendy. I think we're both saying that there needs to be that co-laboring and commitment in the meeting. And I would say, in addition to that, it can be helpful to have a support circle elsewhere too. Like, for example, I'm part of the Soul of Leadership program that the Shalem Institute does, and we have a monthly clearness committee of a group that meets, that we've gotten to know each other and have that be a part of our rhythm. And I find that to be really helpful to have somebody outside of that system that knows enough about it about what's going on, but can also be out from outside of that and have some perspective and wisdom and support. And a friend of mine, Nate Macy, does music ministry and travels around. And he has an anchor committee, and they call it Save the Nate. That's it keeps him grounded and helps him discern. So this slide is just another kind of insight from psychology that I found helpful, that we are responsible to, but not responsible for. And that distinction might be subtle, but I think it's really important. We are responsible for ourselves and to our relationships. That we are not responsible for the feelings, behaviors, reactions of others in our meeting or elsewhere. But we are responsible to that relationship, to stay engaged and to stay connected. And that's where boundaries come in, right? As helpful to recognize where I start and end and where they start and end, and we can meet between those spaces. So accountability is not people pleasing, enabling sabotage, just surrendering to the status quo, but it is about that mutual care and the commitment to hard conversations and deep discernment and co-laboring toward that shared future. And this is from a friend of mine, a Quaker pastor in Indianapolis, Bob Henry, who saw this at a conference. And this relates to just the expectations that people have on pastors specifically, but also on other kinds of public ministers. And he said this is like often how people what they expect from their pastor, especially in preaching. Be vulnerable and honest and personal, but not too personal because this isn't a therapy session. And we need lots of Bible, but not too much because it has to relate to what's happening in our lives and in the world today. But it can't be political, and it has to be challenging and deep and significant, and at the same time, easy for everybody to understand. And it has to be funny, but not too funny because you're not a comedian, you're a pastor. And while you're at it, mix it up and try new things and don't get in a rut, but make sure to be consistent and talk about your own struggles, but not too much because that's depressing. And we love stories about your family, but not too many. That can be weird. Just be vulnerable and honest and dot, dot, dot. And so that's part of to me, is recognizing that um, we are responsible to the relationships, but sometimes in those relationships, there's unrealistic expectations or unhealthy boundaries. And so that's also something we have to discern and process and put boundaries around.
Thank you. Um, yeah, that quote is like the quote from Barbie about, what it is to be a woman. You have to be
Yeah.
everything. Um, I hear a lot of looking at that quote from, the perspective of attachment theory. I hear anxiety and avoidance, and a lack of desire from the congregation saying these competing things, to engage maturely in the labor of being a community of ministers doing this work together. So, what would it mean for your ministry to transform you and your meeting full of people with these competing demands of who you should be and what your ministry should be if you have one, and from your meeting or your religious community, the world. This is a sort of unbecoming photograph of me and another public minister, Adria, formerly Galizia, but she just got married last month, and has a new last name, which I now can't remember. Sorry, Adria, if you're watching this. So Adria is on my support committee. She is not a member of my meeting. So in the last year, so my meeting is Sandy Spring. We're standing in front of the Sandy Spring. As you can see, it's full of water. Um, sarcasm. Um, and she she is on my support committee despite not being a member of my meeting, where my meeting is held. I've been an embraced minister since 2018 in the liberal tradition, because though I had a minute saying that I was an embraced minister, we were not doing a very good job together of holding one another accountable, me and my meeting. Um, and last year, as I became more and more interested in sort of ministry as a topic, through my experiences of having been a public minister for a number of years, I realized that I was a hypocrite. Um, that I believed that our meetings should be places of transformation, and I mostly ignored mine. Um, I was, clerking one day, and someone told me that clerks shouldn't be funny. I was being too funny. Um, that's an example of a hurtful thing that was said. Um, Someone once complained that I was talking about God during a memorial meeting for a dear friend that I had accompanied during her death. Another hurtful thing. Um, so much pain, really. Um, and I, like many people, maybe people in this room, became kind of avoidant of my own religious community. But I would tell people I'm an embraced public friend. Like my minute, still had some meaning, but there was really very little behind that minute anymore. Um, and so, I asked my, greatest champion at meeting, the person that originally told me I was a public minister, a woman named Joan Liversidge, to help. And she said she would. And we put together a support committee. And I said, I think we need someone on the support committee that is not a member of meeting. And she said, okay. And I asked for Adria, and she said, okay. And Adria said, okay. And, in the last year, I can just see, again, it's not perfect, you know, um, it's real labor. And sometimes it's been really painful labor because I've had to admit things about myself inside the context of the support committee that I don't want to look at. And as a result of this labor, the meeting has had to look at itself in a different way. And just recently, Ministry and Council and Finance Committee agreed to fiscally sponsor and meaningfully support a project to support public ministry generally, based on the lessons that we have learned by laboring with each other. So it's an incomplete happy ending, but it's something of a happy ending. It gives me hope. It shows me that, you know, this group of, like all of our meetings are like this. I think like we are imperfect people with terrible attachment styles and bad emotional habits and a lack of knowledge about our history and traditions. And one friend of mine, has called our meetings hummus club, that we go there and like, we're just there for the really high class potluck after. I've heard our meetings called affinity groups for retired people. I've heard that our meetings are dead, but we're not dead because we are living people that are gathered, and living people change. That is the definition of life. Life continues to grow and change as long as it is alive. And there is hope for our meetings, and our ministry is that hope. Andy and I decided to break our presentation here and stop recording in order to have a conversation with you about how your ministry is transforming your meeting and your world. And then we will resume the presentation with some recommendations for you to take back to your meeting.
Wendy, before we stop the recording, I do have a confession. I wasn't paying very much attention to the chat, and there were some things in there. So
Oh, me
um,
either.
when I started talking about Mid-America, I told Michael he could correct me, and he did indeed. So there are actually churches in Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma, West Missouri, Eastern Colorado, and now also one in the Omaha, Nebraska region. So thank you, Michael. Rachel said accountability to a meeting is often different from accountability to a call. And I think that's an important insight. Something I was reflecting on in preparation for this, and I don't have the answers, but it does feel like that accountability to your call is kind of like the first step. So Rachel, you're welcome to say more, but I really like that. Virginia said a part of reconciliation leadership, which is, part of her ministry, is the idea of moving from blame to accountability. I really like that as well.
Andy, can I just say that I put a link to a workshop I gave on that topic at Beacon Hill Friends.
Okay.
It's not it's not near my where I wrote it. It's called this. It's under something called Luna. A little bit farther down. There it is. LU. You see that?
Yes. Yeah. I see the link there. And so folks can, to check that out as well. And then you made a joke. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, one more thing.
Uh-huh.
In our research for the curriculum, I worked at the UN for 30 years, and then I transitioned in my succession planning to Quakerism. And we did a lot of research on the role of the unconscious in leadership.
Mm.
And so, and if anyone wants to see the curriculum, I'd be happy to show you in our Google Classroom. But it's really important to note that we have, and some researchers say that 98% of our waking life is unconscious. And so it's about waking up to and embracing those parts of self that we don't know. And a lot of times, some of the ways we fall down are because of unconscious behaviors in ourselves. Sometimes we'll blurt something out and it will be, misunderstood, or we'll wish we hadn't said that, It comes from this part of ourselves. There's a lot of writing about it. Parker Palmer taught me a lot about it when I was in his work, doing his work. So I just wanted to mention that some of what Wendy and you might be talking about is the unconscious reaction to accountability, and just a thought.
Mhm. Thank you, Virginia. Yeah, I know you have lots of good insights about reconciliation, and that's good. There's often things we're not even aware of that are impacting our behaviors. And Neva had said, but not too many boundaries. I think she was making a joke, reflecting on that, the expectations for preachers and others. So.
Yes, because at the end you said that's why we need boundaries, and after everything else was conditional, I was like, yeah, but not too many boundaries, because then you
Right.
look like you don't care about other people or whatever that excuse would be.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.